It was 10 o'clock at night on June 5, 1944, when the engines of the Douglas C-47s began to roar on the airfields of southern England. The noise was deafening. One after another, those metal giants took off into the darkness over the English Channel, carrying in their bellies 13,000 American soldiers who knew that many of them would not live to see the dawn. Inside those planes, the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions sat in silence, burdened with 40 kilos of equipment. Some prayed. Others looked at photographs of their wives, their girlfriends, their mothers. Many had painted their faces with black polish like Sioux warriors. It was not just camouflage, it was a ritual of war, a way of telling themselves that they were ready for what was coming. Hours earlier, General Eisenhower had walked among them. The soldiers would later remember that look in his eyes. It was a look that mixed pride and concern. Eisenhower knew the figures that no one dared to say out loud. Military experts estimated that casualties among the paratroopers might reach 50%. For the men in the gliders, the forecasts were even worse. Up to 70% might not survive. Eisenhower carried in his pocket a letter already written, taking full responsibility if the operation failed. That letter would never be sent, but at that moment, no one knew it. To understand the magnitude of the operation, it is worth recalling that the landing was not improvised. It was the result of years of secret planning. The Allies had built an elaborate deception and disinformation campaign known as Operation Bodyguard. Its centerpiece was Fortitude, an operation that feigned invasions of Norway and, above all, of the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. With the help of phantom armies made up of wooden tanks, decoys, balloons, and fake radio traffic, as well as double agents who fed Berlin false reports, the Allies managed to make Hitler believe that the real invasion would come further north. That deception tied down important German divisions, including several panzer units far from Normandy, giving the soldiers crossing the Channel the space they needed to establish themselves. The Allies created the fictitious 1st United States Army Group under the command of George S. Patton. Through Plan Quicksilver, double agents such as the Spaniard Juan Pujol, Garbo, sent Berlin detailed reports about imaginary divisions and camps and generated a huge volume of radio transmissions and mock embarkations at Dover to give the impression of a massive force ready to strike at Calais. Patton lent his name to the deception by visiting the fake installations and being photographed there. In this way, German intelligence was convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the real blow would fall on the Pas de Calais. That perception kept many German divisions away from the actual front. Fortitude North reinforced the illusion by suggesting a possible invasion of Norway to pin down troops in Scandinavia. False airfields were also built and simulated bombing raids carried out to strengthen the deception. June 6th was not chosen at random. British and American meteorologists had spent months looking for a window in which low tides, a full moon, and skies clear enough for aircraft would coincide. Only a few days each month offered those conditions. June 5 was the original date, but a storm front forced a postponement. Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, convinced Eisenhower to wait a few hours, predicting a brief improvement that the German observers did not foresee. That decision made the landing possible. A few days later, a storm would have made the operation impossible. 10 minutes after midnight, the first men jumped over France. They were reconnaissance teams, the Pathfinders, whose mission was to mark the drop zones with lights and flares to guide the more than 1,000 aircraft that would follow. But from that very first moment, everything began to go wrong. The sky over the Cotentin Peninsula lit up with German anti-aircraft fire. Tracers climbed from the ground like fingers of light, searching for the planes in the darkness. The pilots, many of them flying their first real combat mission, panicked. They swerved violently to dodge the fire, breaking the carefully planned formations. Low clouds made it impossible to see the ground below. And then, at 1:30 in the morning, the mass jump began. The paratroopers jumped into the void without knowing where they would land. The wind scattered them like leaves in a storm. More than 75% landed far from their designated zones. Some came down more than 20 kilometers from their objectives. In total darkness, disoriented, loaded with so much weight that they could barely move, American soldiers set foot on French soil for the first time. The paratroopers who jumped that night were young but experienced. They had trained for months in England, practicing night jumps and the use of crickets, small brass clickers that allowed them to recognize each other in the dark. Only the men of the 101st received that device. Accuracy in the drop zones varied. In the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, half the men landed in their designated zones, and 3/4 came down within 3 kilometers. Other units were thrown many kilometers away. The 508th suffered one of the worst dispersions, with only 1/4 of its men near their objective. The pathfinders of the 507th were unable to turn on their beacons because of German presence, and many of their comrades came down in marshes and drowned. In addition to the paratroopers, several waves of gliders carried artillery and personnel. Mission Chicago, which carried elements of the 101st, achieved 92% accuracy despite the darkness, while Mission Detroit, with the 82nd, suffered from fog and artillery fire, but still managed to land most of its gliders. Other missions, such as Elmira and Keokuk, arrived at dawn under intense fire, but their artillery loads were essential to support the isolated paratroopers. Private John Taylor of the 101st Airborne saw the sky explode in light as he descended. A gust of wind pushed him far from his zone. When he landed, he lost his compass. For long minutes he lay motionless in the darkness, listening. In the distance, the sound of gunfire. Closer, the croaking of frogs in the marshes. He had to watch the path of the planes still passing overhead to orient himself and figure out where north was. Only then did he start walking where he believed he needed to go. Like Taylor, thousands of men found themselves alone in enemy territory. Some were less fortunate. Fields that were supposed to be green meadows turned out to be swamps. Rommel, the desert fox, now in charge of France's defenses, had deliberately flooded large areas of land to turn them into death traps. Paratroopers who came down there sank into the mud with all their equipment. The weight of their gear dragged them under. Many drowned in barely half a meter of water, unable even to raise their heads. Others never reached the ground alive. German machine guns cut them down as they descended, hanging from their parachutes, completely defenseless. They were like targets in a shooting gallery. In the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, bad luck had it that there was a fire that night. The Germans were awake, forming a human chain to put out the flames, when paratroopers of the 505th Regiment began to fall directly over the town. Soldiers ended up hanging from rooftops, trees, and lampposts. The Germans shot them one by one. One paratrooper became entangled on the church steeple. He pretended to be dead for hours while the battle raged beneath his feet, hoping to survive until dawn. But in the middle of this apparent chaos, something extraordinary was happening. The dispersion of the paratroopers, which seemed like a disaster, became an unexpected advantage. The Germans began receiving contradictory reports from everywhere. Enemy paratroopers here, there, in every direction. The German 352nd and 716th Divisions did not know where to concentrate their forces. Each commander believed that the main attack was in his sector. At 2:30 in the morning, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, reported to his superiors that he did not believe this was the real invasion. He thought it was a diversion. And while the German generals hesitated, Hitler slept at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. No one dared wake him. The panzer divisions, those powerful armored forces that could have crushed the scattered paratroopers, remained immobile. They waited for orders that would arrive far too late. Meanwhile, in the darkness of the French countryside, small groups of American paratroopers began to find one another. They used small metal devices that made a clicking sound. 2 clicks in the darkness answered by 1 click. That was the password. They also shouted into the night, "Flash!" hoping to hear the reply, "Thunder." Little by little, officers and soldiers who had never seen each other before regrouped. It did not matter which company they came from. They formed improvised teams and attacked targets of opportunity. General Maxwell Taylor of the 101st Airborne had landed kilometers from his zone. With just a handful of men gathered at random, he attacked the town of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. When the sun began to rise over France, that crucial town was in American hands. Other groups managed to capture intact bridges over the Meredith and Dove rivers. Those bridges were vital. The Germans would need them to bring reinforcements to the beaches. Now they were cut. While the paratroopers fought inland, out at sea a spectacle unfolded that no one had ever seen before. Nearly 7,000 vessels were moving toward the French coast. It was the largest armada ever assembled in human history. Warships, transports, landing craft. The roar of thousands of engines made the air tremble. Aboard the transports, the infantrymen tried and failed to sleep. The sea was rough, with waves over a meter high. The landing craft rose and fell violently. Men vomited. They used their helmets as buckets, then emptied them over the side, only to fill them again minutes later. Some used those same helmets to bail the water that constantly sloshed into the boats. The smell of vomit, gasoline, and salt water soaked everything. At 2:51 in the morning, Force O, assigned to Omaha Beach, stopped off the coast. They were 23 kilometers from the shore. From there, the transfer began. The soldiers climbed down rope nets into the landing craft dancing in the swell. Laden with 30 kilos of gear, some lost their footing and fell into the water. The icy waves of the channel swallowed them. Not all the bodies were ever recovered. The dawn of June 6th arrived gray and cold. At 5:50 a.m., the battleship Texas opened fire. The roar of her 16-inch guns was like the end of the world. Each shot shook the ship from bow to stern. The shells, each the size of a small car, arced toward the coast in perfect trajectories. Seconds later, explosions on land hurled columns of earth and smoke into the air. Minutes later, the sky filled with aircraft. 270 American Marauder bombers flew over the beaches, dropping more than 4,000 bombs. But the low cloud deck forced the pilots to release their loads too late. They were afraid of hitting their own landing craft already approaching the shore. The bombs fell farther inland onto empty fields. The German fortifications on the beaches remained intact. The German defenses at Omaha were formidable. The beach ended in a shingle bank and a low wall. Behind them, sandy slopes rose up to high bluffs. The Germans had placed 4 lines of obstacles: Belgian steel gates, posts topped with mines, and iron hedgehogs to smash landing craft. Numerous strongpoints with machine guns and interlocking artillery fire covered every meter of sand, allowing enfilade fire along the length of the beach. That is why the preliminary bombardment barely reduced their positions. With 34,000 men landed at Omaha, American losses approached 2,400 men, while the German 352nd Division lost around 1,200 of its 6,000 soldiers. The contrast with Utah was striking. The U.S. 4th Division suffered only about 197 killed, although the airborne units paid a higher price with around 2,500 casualties. The landing was the largest amphibious operation in history. More than 7,000 vessels, including battleships, destroyers, and 4,000 landing craft, supported some 160,000 soldiers from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. The Navy and Air Force provided cover with 12,000 aircraft and thousands of artillery pieces. Despite the losses, by the end of the day, the Allies had established a solid beachhead. At 6:30 sharp in the morning, the first ramps dropped. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red 1, and the 29th Infantry Division advanced into the hell that would become known as Omaha Beach. What was supposed to be a coordinated landing turned into a massacre from the very first second. The American soldiers faced a deadly surprise that Allied intelligence had not detected. The German 352nd Division was there. It was not the weakened battalion they expected to find. It was a full division of veteran soldiers, well-trained, well-armed, well-entrenched in concrete bunkers that the bombardment had hardly touched. When the ramp of Private Ray Nance's landing craft went down in the Dog Green sector, the first thing he heard was a sound he would never forget. The German MG-42 machine guns opened up. Those weapons fired 1,200 rounds per minute. The Germans called them their saws. The sound was not the familiar staccato of American machine guns. It was a continuous tearing of the air, as if someone were ripping a giant sheet in two. The men in the front rank fell before they could take a single step. They simply collapsed onto the ramp. The men behind had to jump over the bodies of their comrades. They plunged into freezing water that reached up to their necks. The weight of their equipment dragged them down. Many disappeared beneath the waves and never came back up. Those who managed to struggle toward the beach discovered that there was no cover at all. The craters that the bombardment was supposed to have created did not exist. There were only 400 meters of open beach, completely exposed to German fire from the bluffs. Captain Lawrence Madill shouted orders no one could hear. The roar of the explosions, the rattling of machine guns, the screams of the wounded merged into a wall of sound. Around him, his men were falling. Combat engineers tried desperately to clear the obstacles Rommel had placed on the beach. They were steel structures designed to rip open landing craft, mines strapped to wooden posts, cutting wire. But working under that fire was suicidal. The amphibious Sherman DD tanks were supposed to reach the shore first to provide fire support. But of the 96 tanks launched into the sea, 27 sank almost immediately. They had been released too far from the coast. The waves swallowed them with their crews still inside. The men trapped in those sinking tanks had no chance. On the bluffs above the beach, Private Heinrich Severlaw of the 352nd Division manned his position in the bunker designated WN-62. His MG-42 had a perfect view of the entire beach. Over the next 9 hours, Severlaw would fire more than 12,000 rounds onto that strip of sand. The Americans would later call him the Beast of Omaha. From his elevated position, he could see everything. He saw soldiers running, crawling, dying. He changed his machine gun barrel 6 times because they overheated from the constant firing. Years later, in an interview, Severlaw would say it was impossible to miss. The beach was so full of men that he simply had to aim and fire. At 7:30 in the morning, General Norman Cota of the 29th Division reached the beach. He saw the disaster and made the most important decision of his life. He established his command post right there in the sand. There was nowhere else to go. While bullets whistled around him, Cota walked upright, shouting to the men paralyzed by terror, "There are only 2 kinds of people who are going to stay on this beach: those who are dead and those who are going to die. So move, get off this beach, now." His courage was contagious. The men who saw him walking unbowed under fire felt ashamed to remain crouched. They began to move. Small groups started pushing toward the draws and ravines that led off the beach. They used the few mortar craters as cover. They advanced meter by meter, crawling over the wet sand stained with blood. By 8:30, the situation was so desperate that the landings were temporarily halted. There was no room on the beach for more men. The dead and wounded carpeted the sand. The water at the shoreline was red. For a moment, the Germans thought they had won, but they were wrong. The Americans kept coming, boat after boat after boat. By 12:30, nearly 20,000 men had landed at Omaha. Slowly, painfully, they began to gain ground. Demolition teams, working under constant fire, managed to blast 5 gaps in the obstacle belts. Navy destroyers came in so close to shore that they nearly ran aground, risking their hulls so they could fire directly into the German bunkers. At 3 in the afternoon, Heinrich Severlaw received the order to abandon his bunker. He had been wounded in the hand. As he pulled back inland, he looked at the beach one last time. People were still coming, more and more landing craft. He knew then that the battle was lost. While Omaha bled, 40 kilometers to the west, a completely different story was unfolding. At Utah Beach, things had gone surprisingly well, or rather, they had gone wrong in a way that turned out to be perfect. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, was 57 years old. He was the oldest officer to land that day. His heart was weak. The doctors had told him he should not go. Roosevelt insisted. He wanted to be with his men. He was among the first to step onto the beach. He immediately noticed that something was wrong. The terrain features did not match the maps. He called his aide and said, "We've landed on the wrong place." A navigational error had brought the entire landing force 1.5 kilometers south of its objective. Roosevelt looked around, assessed the situation, and made a decision that would save thousands of lives. "We are going to start the war from right here," he declared. It was an extraordinary stroke of luck. The sector where they had landed by mistake was far less defended than their original target. The air bombardments, which had failed so miserably at Omaha, had here hit their mark and destroyed many of the defenses. The sea was calmer in this sector. Almost all the amphibious tanks reached shore intact. Casualties at Utah were minimal, fewer than 200 dead, compared with nearly 2,000 at Omaha. But the most extraordinary and daring assault of the day was taking place between Omaha and Utah, at a place called Point du Hoc, a rock cliff rising 30 meters above the sea. There, according to Allied intelligence, the Germans had 6 155mm guns capable of reaching both Utah and Omaha. Those guns had to be destroyed. The mission was assigned to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder. 225 men with an impossible task: climb a vertical cliff under enemy fire and capture the positions on top. They left their transport ship at 4 in the morning. The sea was rough, the rain was falling. Everything went wrong from the start. The coxswain of the lead boat became confused and took them to the wrong cliff. By the time they realized the mistake, precious time had been lost. They had to row against the current to reach Point du Hoc. The effort was exhausting. 2 landing craft sank on the way. The men aboard disappeared into the dark sea. They arrived 41 minutes late. The element of surprise was gone. The Germans were waiting for them at the top. When the boats finally reached the narrow strip of shingle at the base of the cliff, the Rangers fired rockets carrying ropes with grapnels. But the ropes were soaked with seawater and rain. They weighed twice as much as expected. Most fell back onto the beach. The few that reached the top were cut by the Germans, who also threw grenades down from above. The Rangers had to climb with their bare hands. They drove knives and bayonets into the slippery rock, using any crack, any ledge. Some used the extension ladders mounted on the boats, but one arrived broken and was useless. Under constant fire, those men climbed 30 meters of vertical cliff. Sergeant Len Lummel was among the first to reach the top. What he saw took his breath away. The naval bombardment had been so intense that the landscape was unrecognizable, a lunar field of craters. And then he made a devastating discovery. The guns were not there. In their place stood painted telephone poles, decoys. The Germans had moved the real guns days earlier. But Lommel was not a man who gave up. He started searching. He followed wheel tracks on a dirt path leading away from the cliff. He walked 1.5 kilometers inland, alone, in enemy territory. There, camouflaged among trees, he found 5 of the guns. They were pointed toward Utah Beach, ready to fire, but temporarily without crews because the bombardment had destroyed their observation post. Lommel and Sergeant Jack Kuhn used thermite grenades to destroy the elevating and traversing mechanisms of the guns. The mission was accomplished. But now came the hardest part: surviving. Rudder called for reinforcements by radio. The answer was no. Because the prearranged signal indicating that Pointe du Hoc had fallen never arrived, the higher command had redirected the support troops to Omaha. The Rangers were alone. Reduced to fewer than 100 effective men out of the original 225, they had to hold their position against constant German counterattacks. They held out for 2.5 days. The feat of the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc came at enormous cost. Of the 225 men who began the assault, barely 90 were still fit to fight when reinforcements finally arrived 2 days later. Their sacrifice prevented 6 heavy guns from bombarding the beaches and showed that Allied success depended as much on individual bravery as on strategic planning. They used ammunition captured from dead Germans because their own had run out. They ate German rations. When reinforcements finally arrived on June 8, only 90 Rangers were still in condition to fight. By midday on June 6th, the 5 landing beaches were technically in Allied hands. But the situation remained precarious. On Omaha, the beach was still under German artillery fire. The Germans held fortified positions that would resist for days. At 4 in the afternoon, a counterattack by the German 21st Panzer Division almost reached the coast in the British sector. Only the indecision of its commander, who pulled back without clear orders, prevented a disaster. On the Cotentin Peninsula, the paratroopers who had survived the night were still fighting. They attacked German convoys, blew up bridges, and set ambushes. By mid-morning, patrols of the 4th Division that had landed at Utah made contact with paratroopers of the 101 First. The link between airborne and amphibious forces had been achieved. It was one of the main objectives of the day. But crucial towns remained in German hands. Saint-Côme-du-Mont and Carentan, vital road junctions, would remain battlefields for days. The paratroopers, designed for quick operations of 24 to 48 hours, fought on continuously for 33 days without relief, without replacements. Of the 13,000 who had jumped, 1,500 fell in the first 24 hours. As the night of June 6th fell, American soldiers on the beaches dug trenches into the cold sand. There was neither time nor means to bury all the dead. Some bodies still floated in the water, swaying gently in the waves. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and burned gasoline filled the salty air. The wounded groaned in the improvised aid stations set up behind the bluffs. Surgeons operated by flashlight with insufficient anesthesia, doing what they could. At Omaha, Private Robert Sales sat in a bomb crater. He was still shaking. He could not stop trembling. He had seen almost all the men in his section die. The water around him had been tinged red for hours. Later, he would write in a letter that would take weeks to send, "I never thought I'd see the end of that day. I never believed I would survive." At 6 in the evening, the Allied fleet continued to bombard the interior, while more and more men and material came ashore. Engineers worked without rest to clear obstacles and widen the exits from the beaches. Traffic controllers tried to organize the chaos of vehicles, men, and supplies. In some sectors, the congestion was so great that operations had to be paused. The Germans were also still arriving. Units of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend advanced from the interior of France, although their march was constantly harassed by Allied fighter bombers and sabotage by the French resistance. The bridges that the paratroopers had blown up forced them into long detours, but they were coming, and when they arrived, the real battle would only be beginning. In the liberated towns, French civilians timidly emerged from the cellars where they had spent the night, terrified by the bombardment. In Sainte-Mère-Église, an elderly woman stepped into the street and saw an American paratrooper. With trembling hands, she gave him a glass of Calvados. "For 4 years we've waited for this day," she told him, tears running down her cheeks. But the price had been terrible. Allied bombing had killed hundreds of French civilians. Caen, which was supposed to be liberated on the first day, would remain in German hands for more than a month, reduced to rubble. As midnight of June 6th to 7th approached, completing the first 24 hours of the invasion, the American soldiers allowed themselves a moment of reflection. They had done the impossible. Despite all the errors, all the chaos, all the terrible losses, they had established solid beachheads on enemy territory. Utah was secure. Omaha, bought with blood, was in Allied hands. The paratroopers held key positions inland. In England, General Eisenhower could finally breathe. His greatest gamble had paid off. The letter in his pocket, accepting responsibility for failure, would never be sent. But he knew this was only the beginning. For the men on the beaches, the war was just beginning. Many would not see the next dawn. Others would fight for weeks through the Normandy bocage, that nightmarish maze of hedgerows and fields where every meter was paid for in blood. The Battle of Normandy would last until the end of August. 73,000 Allied soldiers would die before France was liberated. Beyond the main beaches, other actions determined the success of the invasion. In the heart of the Normandy bocage, the fight for the causeway and bridge at Lafayette over the Mirderet River dragged on for 4 days. Without that crossing, the forces advancing from Utah could not link up with the interior. Paratroopers and glidermen of the 82nd Airborne clung to the bridge under constant enemy fire. The battle, described as one of the bloodiest for such a small unit, cost the lives of more than 250 Americans. The division's death toll on D-Day itself was relatively low, 156 men, but many more would fall while they held the flooded causeway and surrounding fields. Meanwhile, on the eastern flank, the British 6th Airborne Division carried out Operation Dead Stick, a glider coup de main to seize intact the bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. 6 gliders landed at 0016, just a few meters from their targets. 180 men of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry captured the bridges within minutes and repelled counterattacks until reinforcements arrived. Their losses were surprisingly light, 20 dead and 50 wounded. Thanks to them, German armor was unable to cross the Orne to attack Sword Beach. The British and Canadian sectors also suffered and triumphed. At Juno Beach, where 21,400 Canadian soldiers landed, pre-invasion estimates spoke of up to 2,000 casualties. In the end, the 3rd Canadian Division lost 340 killed, 574 wounded, and 47 captured. The Canadians advanced farther inland than any other amphibious force that day. At Sword and Gold, the British landed 28,845 and 25,000 men respectively, and suffered 426 and 413 casualties. While at Omaha, 43,250 Americans took about 3,000 casualties, and at Utah, 21,000 men suffered 197 losses. Although none of the divisions achieved all of their objectives, the creation of several interconnected beachheads ensured strategic success. In all, around 23,400 paratroopers and glidermen jumped or landed in Normandy from 822 aircraft, and nearly 160,000 Allied soldiers took part in D-Day. Of the more than 10,300 dead, wounded, or missing that day, the majority were American, but Britons, Canadians, and soldiers from 12 other nations also fell. The immense logistical machine behind the invasion became clear in the weeks that followed. By the end of June, more than 850,000 men, nearly 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies had been landed. Much of that cargo passed through the artificial Mulberry harbors, floating engineering marvels built in England and towed to Normandy. The Mulberry B harbor, installed off Arromanches, operated for 10 months and allowed more than 2 million men, 4 million tons of supplies, and 500,000 vehicles to disembark. The American Mulberry A off Omaha was destroyed by a storm on June 19th, forcing the continuation of landings directly over the beaches. But on that first night, as the stars appeared over the blood-stained beaches of Normandy, one thing was clear. Hitler had lost his bet. The Atlantic Wall, that fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, had been breached. The American soldiers, many of them farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, students from California who had never seen the ocean before enlisting, had achieved the impossible. Private John Barnes of the 1st Division wrote in his diary that night, "Today I saw things no man should ever see. I saw my friends die. I saw the sea turn red. I saw men calling for their mothers as they bled out in the sand. But I also saw something else. I saw real courage. I saw men who were as scared as I was, but who went on anyway. I saw the best and the worst of what we're capable of as human beings. And now I'm here, alive, in France, and tomorrow we'll keep going." Those first 24 hours changed the course of the war. They changed the course of world history, and they were bought at the highest price there is, the lives of thousands of young men who would never return home. That night, as the survivors tried to sleep on the cold sand, wrapped in their blankets, with the distant sound of artillery as a backdrop, they knew only one thing. They had survived the longest day. And that, for now, was enough.